So if we could start with your full name, please.
Muriel, do you want my middle name? Not my maiden name. In the Army, I used my maiden name, Muriel Phillips Engleman. But otherwise, my middle name is Rose, which I don't like.
That was both my grandmother's names.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And where and when were you born?
I was born in Meriden, Connecticut on January 12th, 1921.
So how old does that make you currently?
I'm 96 and a half.
Wow. And which branch of the armed services were you a part of?
Army Nurse Corps.
Now, were you attached to any specific unit?
Yes, I was with the 16th General Hospital for almost 3 years.
Okay. And what years did you serve?
From 1943 to 1946.
And you volunteered?
Oh, yes.
Now, did you receive any medals or commendations?
Oh, yes, I have a whole bunch of them, and I have 3 battle stars. I've got them all framed in the den if you want to see them.
Are you able to name specifically what they are?
Well, the Battle of the Ardennes, the Battle of Northern France, and I can get them for you.
That's okay. We can grab those.
Okay.
Let me just make sure I'm not skipping over
Battle
anything. Now, did you have any rank?
I was a first lieutenant.
First lieutenant. Okay, great. Great. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about your childhood and growing up.
Okay.
Tell me about your parents. What were their names?
Marion Phillips, and my father was Samuel Phillips.
Great. And what did your father do for
My father was a jeweler by profession, and then he went, because we lived in Meriden, which was home of International Silver, and he was interested. He did a lot of work engraving. He had wonderful talent for engraving, and he would engrave things on silver. And he thought, well, if International Silver can do so well, maybe I can too. So then he went into manufacturing, and to manufacture silver goods and so forth. But it was at the height of the beginning of the Depression, and he sort of lost his shirt at it. But then he started manufacturing pewter, and that was what picked him up. But then he died at a very early age, the age of 40. So.
How old were you when he died?
I was 10 then.
That must have been tough to lose your father.
Oh, it was. It was very unexpected. He went into the hospital to have a herniorrhaphy, bilateral herniorrhaphy, and the operation was successful, but he picked up scarlet fever in the hospital, and they didn't have any sulfa drugs in those days, and that was it.
Now, did you have any siblings growing up?
Yeah, I had a sister who was 2 years older and a brother who was 9 years younger. And of course, my mother, his business was just starting to grow, but my mother had to sell the factory, and the only thing she could do, she was an excellent seamstress. She loved sewing, and she had done millinery work before she married. So she went into doing alterations first at home, and then she opened her own dress shop. And that dress shop flourished, and she stayed in business till she was 85. People came from all over Connecticut to buy my mother's clothes. She had excellent taste. She liked tailored things, but good quality merchandise, and she'd tell her customers the truth. She'd say, "You can't wear this dress. The stripes are going crosswise, and you're too heavy, and it accentuates your hips." But they liked it. I mean, they came for her. She'd tell them the truth. It may have hurt, but it sold her dresses.
They appreciated her honesty.
Right. And my mother was very active in Hadassah. She formed that was, I don't know whether you're familiar with Hadassah, but this was, they sent money to Israel. This was just when Israel was beginning, the beginning of Israel, and it's a national organization, and so she formed the first group in Meriden, and she was president of it and a very active member for 10 years. And then when my father died, then she gave up the presidency.
Now, did your parents immigrate to the
My father came from Russia. My mother was born here.
And after your father had passed away, did your mother eventually remarry?
She never remarried. Nobody wanted a poor widow with 3 kids.
So your mother had to take over the responsibilities of...
She took over everything, and she did a great job. The whole town respected her. They turned out for her funeral, and she made the front pages when she died. And she had a lot of guts and determination, and she was very active, in the women's club and other organizations. And even, when she got established in business and she had a little more time, she learned to drive. We finally got a car after the war, and she did all right for herself.
And what year did she pass?
Oh, yeah. Now all of a sudden you hit me. Let's see, she was 96 when she died, and she was born in 1893. You figure out the mathematics.
96, 89? Does that sound right? 1989?
Could be.
Okay. So you mentioned your brother was 9 years younger than you. So
He's still alive. My sister is dead. She died about 4 years ago.
Okay. Now, growing up during the Great Depression, your mother obviously had to take those responsibilities of raising and
right.
Caring for you guys.
Running the house, yeah.
So did you guys, you and your sister, start working at an early age to help out with that, or was there anything that you guys had done?
Going to school, I did babysitting in those days. You'd do a babysitting job for $25 cents for the whole night, and that meant doing the dishes that had accumulated in the sink the whole day, and bathing the kids and putting them to bed and stuff.
So you really earned that 25
I really earned that 25 and then 35 cents. But the thing was, sometimes I'd get a babysitting job 2 miles away on the other side of town, and they wouldn't come and pick me up or drive me home, and I'd have to walk up this hill 2 miles away and then walk home again. Sometimes, if they were generous, they'd drive me home.
And about how old were you when you were doing this?
Well, I was, I guess, from 12 on. I did it throughout my years in high school.
Now, were you and your sister pretty close growing up?
Yeah, we were.
Do you remember some of the things that you guys used to do to pass the time?
Well, we used to make fudge. But my sister was tall and thin, and she loved to dance. She was very graceful, and she had a beautiful figure, and my mother loved to make clothes for her. And I was always hungry. I was a little on the dumpy side. And mealtime, my mother wouldn't let me have seconds. Of course, I'd sneak them out once they were back in the refrigerator. But we weren't that close. She had her own friends. And of course, sometimes my mother would say, well, you've got to take Muriel to the movies with you. And of course, she'd bitch. But we got along.
Now, is there anything else that you remember, any hardships that you guys experienced growing up during the Great Depression? Anything that sticks out in your mind?
Well, I mean, we had to be very careful. My mother was very frugal in her shopping and cooking. We never had anything like steaks, and it was a rare occasion if we had a pot roast or something. We ate a lot of fish and a lot of liver, and but my mother was very health conscious. We had a lot of fruits and vegetables, but whatever things were on sale and in season, she didn't squander money, especially on food. She didn't believe food was, especially fattening foods. And whenever she made a cake, It was never had a frosting on it. It was always a spice cake or something, nothing fancy at all. A sensible cake.
Yes.
We always had help though. We always had someone to do the housework and to take care of my baby brother. And in those days, help was very cheap, and would have somebody living in. Well, my mother needed it anyways, especially when she went to work, until my sister and I were old enough to take over.
Now, do you think growing up with those values and that sensibility that your mother had, how do you think that influenced the way you grew up?
Oh, it definitely influenced me. To this day, when I first started dating Mel, he'd say, when you go out with me, don't look at the right-hand side of the menu to see what the price is. I was always very conscious. I'd always order the cheapest thing on the menu. And to this day, I still look at the price. I don't buy, well, first of all, we don't eat beef anyways. He doesn't eat it. And so we eat very sensibly, and we live and at this age, we live very, very sensibly. Go to bed early and don't do any long-distance driving or carousing.
Now, tell me about your high school career. Did you graduate from high school?
I graduated from Meriden High School in 1938. And I loved high school. I had a wonderful time. I joined all the different organizations, and of course they all had parties every month, and with goodies that we never had at home. They'd have, Coca-Cola and ice cream and candies and cookies, and I definitely had a great time. But I was active in school. I was active in the dramatic club, and I loved acting. When I was in junior high school, my class, in 8th grade, I guess we put on, or maybe 9th grade, we put on a play, Little Women. I loved that book. I had read it dozens of times over and over again, and I could quote it verbatim, even to this day. And so I was the director of that, and also I was one of the chief characters in it. And we made quite a name for ourselves. We played it at all the different schools and in Meriden at the time, and it was a fun thing. I was really interested in dramatics.
And do you remember some of your friends?
Oh yes, yeah.
What their names were?
One of them, my closest friend, was Betty Brown. I wrote about her in the book. Did you read that?
I haven't gotten to read the book
okay.
yet, but
Okay, well, Betty was gorgeous. She was knock 'em dead gorgeous. She had, beautiful, long, dark, curly hair and these black, sparkling eyes and beautiful complexion, and she was absolutely stunning. And she just suffered from, she just didn't think she was good enough. She lived with her mother, who had been divorced, and her grandmother, and they were always picking on her. And, they would just tell her she just had no self-confidence. And every guy in class would have given their eye teeth to date her, And so she finally, when we graduated from high school, she had been going with the guy who was the most handsome guy in high school, and she was going to be the most beautiful. They had different classifications. But she started dieting because her grandmother and her mother kept picking on her, and she kept saying, "I'm too fat," and she was like this, and me, I was like this. And when we'd walk to school, she'd say, "Don't walk, run, jump, lose weight, take it off," But she got to be so skinny, she was like a walking skeleton. So by the time we graduated, she did not get the vote of the most gorgeous woman in the class, in which her mother and her grandmother were furious. But eventually she did meet some other guy who fell in love with her, and they married, and they were all very happy for her. But then came the war, and I saw him when I went overseas, his outfit. He was with the, I think the 83rd Division, and he'd come to see me and bring some of his buddies, and I'd fix them up with, that he'd find a date himself among some of our nurses. And then after the war, we went home, but Bill, her husband, was so accustomed, to other women that he wasn't faithful to Betty, and eventually she committed suicide. So, but she was such a gorgeous, lovely, sweet person.
So sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Now, did any of your friends serve during the war as well?
Well, Betty, there were other classmates who served. I know there was one boy in my class who was in the service, and he married one of my classmates, and they had a baby, but of course he was overseas and he was killed. He never came home, but then she ended up marrying another one of my classmates, so she was happy for the rest of her life.
And you said you graduated high school in 38?
38, yeah.
38. Okay. So what did you do after you graduated from high school?
Well, when I was in high school, I'd always planned to become a nurse. Okay. I mean, that was understood. My father's mother in Russia had a midwife clinic, and the whole family said, oh, Muriel, brings home every stray cat and dog and bandages them and stuff, and they always said I had the bent for taking care of people and animals. And well, this is what I had planned on, but then my last year in high school, everybody said, oh, chemistry is terrible and the teacher is awful, and I was so afraid I was going to flunk it that I didn't take it. So then after I graduated high school, I couldn't go into nurses training because I needed chemistry. And so then I went to business college, and I learned to do typing and shorthand. I was surprised because I have hands like feet. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. But after a while, that got kind of boring for me, and so then I decided I really want nursing. So then I decided to. So I applied at Northeastern University in Boston to take a 3-month course in chemistry, which allowed me to apply for nurses training, and so that's when I went in training in Cambridge, Mass. That was in, I guess, class of 39, I guess. Yeah, because I graduated high school in 38 and lost a whole year at business college, so.
So when did you graduate from nursing school? When did you start practice? Did you start practicing in the U.S.?
No. Well, after I graduated from training, which was in 1940, yeah, 43, 40, 42. Then I had to take state boards and apply for the Army. But it took me 6 months, to go through all the red tape. I mean, after I graduated training in state board, got my state boards, then I worked for a few months doing private duty cases just to accumulate some money. And but then I enlisted in the Army. I was commissioned in April of 43, and that's when I went to my first Army post, which was at Fort Adams, Rhode Island.
So, in the late 30s,
yeah,
before Pearl Harbor,
yeah,
were you aware of what was going on in Europe?
Not really. I mean, we had studied, current events and so forth in school. We knew there were things we had studied, Japan and China and stuff, and but then in training, we weren't aware. You were so involved in your nurses training, it just kept you occupied. But then in my second year, then we heard about Pearl Harbor. I know I was on day duty working in pediatrics. It was on a Sunday, and we heard on the radio in the doctor's office that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. and that was a shocker. And then we realized, that this meant war and that they would be needing nurses. And at that time, at least 2/3 of my nursing class all said, well, we'll join the service as soon as we graduate. But it was almost another year before we graduated and took state boards, before we could join up. So I'd say at least half of my classmates joined either the Army or the Navy.
So you kind of made up in your mind that day that.
Oh yeah, I knew we knew we were going to be needed, and this is drummed into you all during your training. That nurses are to service humanity and encourage them to get well, and this and that sort of stuff.
Interesting. Initially, did you have any ideas? Now, looking back after you experienced your time during the war,
yeah.
Was it anything that, how do I want to say this? Could you have imagined it being anything like it was, what you actually did experience?
No, we never thought that, we knew that, would be working in a hospital, but we had no idea that it would be as bad as it was. Some phases of the Army, people, it was a nice, peaceful life. Like one friend here who was in the Pacific, and she was far from everything. They just had the insects and the snakes and the animals and the jungle to worry about, but they were nowhere near they never saw or heard a bomb or anything.
Now, after you had finished your nursing training,
yeah,
and you'd already made up your mind that you were going to join the Army.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Can you talk about that process? Did you go to a recruitment office? How did you sign up for the process?
I had decided, I was in Massachusetts and Cambridge during my training, and Camp Edwards in Massachusetts, that was in Massachusetts, and at this point in time during my training years, the area was just loaded with soldiers, and they'd come into Cambridge and Boston to socialize, and so I'd met a lot of soldiers there, and so it was just automatically, I just assumed that I would join the Army, and of course I liked the Navy uniforms better, but I joined the Army.
And what was that process like?
We had to go to the I was working and doing private duty in New York at the time. My sister was married and living in Long Island and Forest Hills, so I was doing private duty. So I would go into New York, and there was a board there, I guess an enlistment board, and you had to fill out papers and go through an examination and all that sort of stuff, and show your graduation and state board stuff, and then finally, after weeks, then you'd get notice that you were qualified and duly inducted into the service.
Now, after you were inducted, did you have any specific training? Being a nurse, I imagine it would be a bit different than if you were, signing up as infantryman or something. But
no, I was automatically assigned to report to the hospital at Fort Adams in Newport, Rhode Island.
And was there any more, extensive training or more specific training related to
not
wounds
there.
And injuries?
No, not there, because Fort Adams was a small post, was a beautiful post on the, on the, what was the river? Anyways, it was gorgeous. It was like a country club. It was an old post, a very old post, and I think there were 12 nurses. We all lived in this big old colonial home at the top of the hill, and every day a bus would come and pick us up and take us down to the hospital buildings, and we were, assigned to different buildings to work, and would do our duty shifts. But saw no signs of action. Here we're still in this country, and it's all very civilized, And the cases you'd get would be measles, appendectomies, or a car accident, or a broken leg. One patient I had a severe case of poison ivy. He had squatted out on a march and he was covered with poison ivy. So, but it was these cases, and after 3 months I said, I've had it. I applied for overseas duty. I wanted a little more action than these cases. I could have stayed home. So then they sent me to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where the 16th General Hospital was being activated for overseas duty. And so for the next 6 months we spent, we were busy 12 hours a day, getting ready, learning, going on 15-mile hikes and having gas mask drill. We were all given gas masks, and learning to do the infiltration course where you crawled on your knees under live ammunition, and then we had to learn how to descend a swaying rope ladder with all your gear piled all around you, emulating the ways of the ship. And believe me, and it was just like that too when we landed. And we studied all sorts of communicable diseases, every disease out. Yours, Tsutsugamuchi fever, and ones that were peculiar to the tropics especially. And eventually, before we went overseas, they gave us uniforms for the tropical uniforms, so we all figured, well, that's where we're going. But in the mid-ocean, 3 days after we were at sea, they took away the uniforms and gave us winter uniforms, which was typical of the Army. So I'm trying to think what else. We studied just about everything, map reading and how to read a compass, and of course we learned how to use K-rations and use your mess kit, everything with your aluminum mess kit. And what else?
So how did all that training, I guess,
it stood us in good stead because we were in good shape physically. I didn't get sick at all, really. Well, we all did the minute we got to England, but otherwise throughout the war I was in good shape.
And I know you volunteered for overseas duty, but did that, like you said, crawling under the live ammunition, did that change your psyche at all?
No.
Going into it? You
No.
knew what to sort of expect?
Yeah.
You knew what you signed up for?
Yeah. By this time, we had classes on everything. I wish I could remember. Well, I've got this big. Well, I guess, but I don't know whether it's written down there. I have a scrapbook that's falling apart with all these pictures of me going through, throughout the war, and it's pretty dog-eared by now, and the printing is getting. I wrote a lot in the book, so maybe I should have read through that to see, because it told a lot of things.
It's okay. So was everybody that went overseas?
Yeah.
Were they all volunteers, or did they?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. All the physicians and nurses, and.
And when did you disembark for your?
Let's see. We left this country, I think, on December 28th. So we shipped out of Boston Harbor, December 28th, 1943, and we landed. And we were in a convoy of 60 to 70 ships, and we landed in Liverpool, England, on January 8th, 1944. There was one other ship beside our ship that landed at Liverpool. All the other ships in the convoy went up to Glasgow, and I wrote about that story in my book, the story of Harry, my boyfriend, who was on the ship in front of us, and the Admiral of the Fleet was on board ship. Well, Harry had called, before we sailed overseas, we were in the staging area for 3 days at Camp Miles Standish, and you couldn't, what's the word for it? Well, we couldn't write to anybody. We couldn't receive phone calls. You couldn't make any phone calls.
You're quarantined.
We were in quarantine, thank you. And the night before we left, and I was checking my luggage, and the phone rang, and somebody said, "Lieutenant Phillips, there's a phone call for you." And I was panic-stricken. I didn't know how anybody knew I was there because I hadn't been in touch with anyone. Well, it was I had a boyfriend at the time who was a dentist in the Navy. And I said, "How did you know I was here?" And he said, "Don't ask any questions." He said, "I just want you to know you're going to be going overseas in my convoy." Well, this was great, So I couldn't wait to see him, So we boarded the ship the next day, and of course the first few days we were indoctrinated into how to, the ship's movements and getting lifeguard, going through lifeboat drill and all that stuff. And so as soon as we learned the ropes of the ship, I made my way to the Navy Communications Office, and there were 2 Navy guys there, and they said, "Well, how can we help you?" And I said, "I'm looking for the USS Dorothea Dix." We were in this huge convoy with all these ships across the Atlantic Ocean, and they both started to laugh, and they pointed at the ship in front of ours. They said, "That's your ship, and the Admiral of the Fleet is aboard the ship." Well, I was so excited, and our whole hospital unit, all of us, they had to hear about it. They heard about it, and before you knew it, we were all standing at the railing with binoculars looking for Harry, this good-looking dentist in a Navy uniform. Well, we looked, and I couldn't look. There were thousands of troops aboard his ship. I didn't realize he was, downstairs in the dental clinic working on teeth. So after a couple of days, nothing happened, and so I decided I was going to get a message to him, let him know where I was. And of course, all the names of all the ships had been painted out. You just had numbers. So I went back to the Navy officers, and this time I brought them a bottle of Canadian Club that I had been carrying with me. And I said, "Can you send a message to them, to Harry?" And the message was, I told him, "I'm aboard the Dorothea Dix, which is behind you." And we watched them flashing the message over to the ship, and we watched them receive it. And a couple of days later, I get this yellow telegram handed to me, and I still have that telegram. And it said, "For Lieutenant Muriel Phillips, we'll try to contact you ashore." Well, that was it. So I spent the rest of the trip hanging over the railing, looking for him aboard, with those millions of people aboard his ship. Never saw him. Anyways, when we landed, Associated Press was there in England to take pictures of us, and here we are. I've got pictures of that too, of us coming off the ship loaded down with all of our gear and piled around our necks, our heads, our waists, this and that. And everybody's in the photograph except me. I'm still hanging over the railing looking for Harry. Well, nothing. Harry never showed up. Then they loaded us onto trains and took us to a staging area. By this time we're in England. It's dark, it's damp in January, cold, drizzly. And I guess in the middle of the night we landed at this place. And then we had beds in Quonset huts. I think they held about 30 beds. And it was so cold, you'd dress up to go to bed at night rather than undressing. And and everybody immediately got sick. We all got colds, and the English hack, some of them had that English hack that lasted for the rest of the war. We all ended up in the hospital. Anyways, Harry never showed up, never heard from him. And finally, 6 weeks later, I finally get a scathing letter from him. "What in the world are you trying to do to me?" He said, "Thanks to your first message sent to the ship," he said, sent to the Admiral of the Fleet, was handed that message, and he called me to him, and he accused me of being a spy, and he said this message could have alerted the whole, he said German submarines were throughout the ocean and looking for us. He said we had a zigzag throughout the ocean to avoid these submarines. If they had ever gotten your message, they could have destroyed the whole convoy, which is true. And so he finally convinced the admiral that he wasn't a spy, and I was just, he didn't say I was a stupid nurse, but I'm sure that's what he meant. And that the admiral said, okay, just make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, it happened again because once we arrived in Liverpool, and 3 days later, and I hadn't heard from Harry, I went, and we could make telephone calls. I went to the telephone and got the operator and gave her the name of his ship, which you never do, and the location of the ship at the Mersey docks in Liverpool, and sent him a message letting him know where I was. So this time he was really mad, and he said, now they think both of us are spies, and we're both going to be courts-martialed. And so he talked, and so anyways, we were never courts-martialed, but he was really pissed off at me. And so by this time, I decided, okay, I'd better start. There were plenty of flyboys around, and I was dating this one and that one. And then eventually he simmered down, and he kept sending me all the packages of Goldenberg nut chews and peanuts every time his ship landed in a port. His was a troop ship, and he was a transport, and he was going back and forth. So I'd get these cartons of food. Of course, I was getting fatter by the minute, but anyways, eventually he came to see me, and I have pictures of him too. But I had cooled off by then, so we remained just very good friends for the rest of my life and the rest of his life. He came, when Mel and I got married. He met Mel when we were courting, and at first Mel didn't trust him at all. But they were fellow dentists. They had a lot in common. And then after Mel and I were married, he'd come to visit us, and he knew how to do everything. He could do carpentry and electric work, and he knew everything about plumbing. And so here we had built a house out in the woods, and he did everything. There wasn't anything he couldn't do. And so he and Mel became real great friends, and Mel would go off to his office, and Harry would come and he'd stay for a whole week. And he'd do all sorts of jobs around the house. And then when we had kids, he'd build toys for them and cabinets in their rooms. And he was just a wonderful friend. And the whole family knew him as Uncle Harry, and Uncle Harry was there for all family occasions. And then he never married, and eventually he died. I guess, I don't know how old he was. But we remained good friends up until the end.
Now let me ask you, you said one of you guys were about 3 days into the journey across the Atlantic. They switched your uniform.
Yeah.
Do you think that was intentional?
Yeah,
You guys...
it was to steer the Germans off course, because they felt they had spies all over the place. And this was what would always happen. Yeah, no, this was done intentionally.
Normal procedure.
Because we had, in case it had slipped out among us that we were going to go to the Pacific, instead we fooled them, whoever knew about it.
Yeah. And had you guys received instructions that you'd be headed to the Pacific, or were you guys not told anything?
We were not told. We had studied all the tropical diseases and learned what to do, for, sterilizing water and this and that, but we were not told you weren't told anything.
And did you have a preference as to which theater you were sent to, or you were just there? We
had no idea where we were going at all.
But I guess personally, if you had a choice.
Oh, I'm glad that I went to Europe. At least it was civilized. Like we ended up in Liège, Belgium, which was a gorgeous city. And of course, when we first landed, and then we had our hospital in near Wrexham in England, out in the boondocks. But it was close enough to nearby towns, and 50 miles from Manchester. I had relatives in Manchester, and so we were close to civilization.
And you said that you guys landed in England in January.
In January 43, yeah.
43?
44. Yeah.
Okay. So, what were you guys doing after you landed there for?
Well, then we
6 months?
we had a hospital that was being built. So in the meantime, we were put on detached. We stayed at the 304th General Hospital, and it's just yesterday I got something from somebody who's doing a book on hospitals in England, and she's writing up our hospital. I guess she had contacted me 2 or 3 years ago, and I had sent her all sorts of pictures and told her about everything I could tell her about our hospital while we were in England, and being at the 304th General Hospital. Excuse me, there's the doorbell.
No problem. Here,
Oh,
I'll pull this up.
unless Mel maybe Mel will get it. I don't know who it is.
I'll get it.
Okay.
Hello. How are you today? Oh, fine. Good. I am in the middle of writing you a letter. Oh.
So I think where we left off, we were talking about right after you landed in England.
Yeah.
And kind of what you were doing for.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Then they put us. Right here we had. We're at the staging area, and we stayed there for a few. I don't know how long it was. It seemed like forever, because we all got sick, and then we went to this 304th General Hospital, and we stayed there for months. We lived there because our hospital was being built, and so once our hospital was built, then we moved out and into those buildings. But we were there at the 304th for a few months, I think. But in the meantime, while we were there, they sent us on detached service with other hospitals, so we'd work there. And they'd load us into trucks and take us to another hospital a few miles away.
The patients that you were working with, what type of?
Well, they were just, D-Day. They hadn't invaded France yet.
So
this is all, automobile accidents, pneumonia, whatever, the whooping cough, and whatever they were. We worked in those hospitals. Of course, we had a lot of time off on our hands too. It was boring.
Now, in general, did you guys receive any combat wound specific training before you actually experienced working with those guys?
Oh yeah, well, we had classes on the type of wounds to expect and how they would be treated, but we had different branches some would work in the operating room, this one would work here, wound care, and it all depended what branch of the hospital you were in, whether it was psychiatric or communicable diseases or fractures or orthopedic or just general nursing care. So I did surgery. I was in the operating room for some time, and then it was when we were still in this country, and we were still here when we were at Fort Devens. The chief nurse wanted me to take an anesthesiology course. They wanted me to become a nurse anesthetist, and I took it, but I got sick. I got pneumonia in the middle of it, and I was really sick. They had me in an oxygen tent. They sent for my mother. They thought I was dying, and so then by the time I got out, then I was on leave on 6-week leave, sick leave for 6 weeks. So when I came back, I didn't do anesthesia, which pleased me. I wasn't that crazy about it because I found I was breathing with the patients, and So I was happier, just doing, whether I worked in the operating room or doing surgical nursing, whatever, but I was glad I didn't have to do anesthesia again.
Now, who were some of the first, combat soldiers that you worked with, that you treated? Was it from the D-Day invasion? Were those?
Yeah, those were the first combat ones. We had treated, because there hadn't been any fighting
Right.
up until then, until D-Day, which was on June 6th of 44.
Right. So I guess leading up to the invasion,
We were busy preparing and setting up. We had been setting up our hospital while we were even at the 304th station. I guess it was a station, or 304th General, I guess. We were busy. Would go to our hospital, would roll bandages, and would supply, line the closets with everything that we would need. And so that took, months really, getting ready while they were still, pouring cement for sidewalks and stuff like that outside.
And did you guys know what you were preparing for? Did you get a sense of?
We knew that there was going to be something big, that they were going to do something at some point. But we didn't know just what it was. There were constant inspections. We had a name for it, the theater, European Theater of Inspections. Because there was always, you'd stop doing it, be working in your ward or whatever, and all of a sudden, the colonel was there, and there's inspector in there, and the whole retinue was there, and you'd stand at attention and salute, and then the spit and polish was horrendous. You'll see pictures that I have there of the hospital floors. You could eat off of them, and the colonel would come in. He'd wear white gloves and carry a roll of toilet paper in his hand, and if he saw a smudge on the floor, he'd reach down and try to, if the smudge came off on his glove, that meant that somebody didn't do a good job cleaning the floor, and it'd give the nurse a dirty look, But if the smudge didn't come off on his glove, it meant that it was normal wear and tear, It was her, and then he'd bounce pennies on the sheets to make sure the sheets were tight enough. I wrote about that in the book too.
Wow. So, I guess, can you talk about those first few days when you guys, the hospital, I'm assuming, was set up at this point, or when the invasion of Normandy?
Oh yeah, we were all set up and running. We had been set up and running then.
So can you talk about those days when you guys first started receiving the combat wounded?
Yeah. But the thing is, we didn't stay there long enough to really. But once they started coming in, because we didn't get them until a couple of days after D-Day. First they were treated locally down on the southern coast, and then they gradually worked their way to where we were in North Wales. And by that time, at that point, we got orders to get ready to ship out to go overseas. Well, this took forever because we got orders, I think on a Sunday, to move out in 2 hours, to pack up, move out. Here we had all bought bicycles that we left in our bicycle racks in front of our huts, and we had to pick up, move out. We rode all night long in the train, sitting up, and then we ended up landing on the southern coast of England, this little town of Bridport. And nobody was there to greet us. We just milled around for the longest time, and finally somebody came and gave us orders. We marched off to this huge old mansion on the outskirts of town, and I have pictures of that place, and this place had been deserted for years, and of course was filled with rats and mice and mouse droppings, and of course we had to clean it up and move in. And the male officers were in a nearby mansion also called Mountbank. And so we stayed there for over a month, It was the month of July. Here we thought, we were going to be headed for France almost immediately, but instead we spent the whole month of July in Bridport, and it was the hottest July they had ever had. So every day would march to the beach, but it was a rocky beach. You couldn't even walk on it. And it was too cold. The water was too cold to swim, but a few people did swim. But at least we got our exercise, our walk, and every day when we'd walk to the beach, my roommate and I would pass this couple who were always gardening, and I'd stop to talk to them. And finally, they said, I happened to mention that we were, bathing out of our helmets, our steel helmets. We didn't have any running water or anything in our fancy mansion. And so they invited us to come and use their bathtub. So a couple of times a week, we didn't want to overdo it. We came and used their bathtub, and of course would always bring food from the mess hall. We'd go to the mess sergeant, and he'd give us, canned foods, and they were delighted to have it because they had been on war rations for years, and everything was, wherever you went, the British people would apologize for the conditions of their homes, the paint they hadn't painted, the roofs were missing, tiles were missing, and so forth. Clothing was tight. They had been at war really for couple of years at least. So we were happy to bring rations and things like that. And so we became very friendly with this couple, and I took a lot of photos of them, and then we met their grandchildren, Admiral Edwards and his wife, and their grandchildren. Well, years later, I got a letter from one of the was it one of the nurses, or a friend of mine who knew that I had been in Bridport, and she said Bridport is celebrating their 50th anniversary of D-Day, and they want pictures or any stories of Americans who were in Bridport at that time. Well, I had all these photographs of there that I had taken of the Admiral and his grandchildren, and stories, so I sent them to the newspaper. Well, I know who was, a daughter of my friend, my very dear friend, her daughter had married an Englishman, was living there, and so she knew that we had been in Bridport, so she was the one who wrote to me. So I sent all these pictures to the newspaper, and of course when the newspaper came out, they had all these pictures on the front page. And then I got letters from Admiral Edwards' grandchildren. They were all adults by this time, but they were grandparents themselves, and they were thrilled to see all the pictures of themselves and their grandparents, And by this time we were living in Florida, so I invited them to come to Florida and use my bathtub. So anyways, where was I? Where was I?
Well, I was asking about the first.
Oh yeah.
The first, sort of the combat wounded that you encountered.
Yeah. Well, we weren't nursing. We were still in Bridport, and then finally, after a month, then they moved us to Southampton, and then we boarded a ship to cross to France, and that ship, the male officers, ran down to the get the staterooms first, and before you know it, they were back on deck, and they said, we decided you nurses should have the staterooms because there weren't enough for everybody. Well, we went down, and we knew why they came up. They were full of bed bugs. So we all slept on deck for, it took us 4 nights and 3 days to cross the English Channel, and till we landed at Utah Beach. And of course, at night when everything was complete blackout. You couldn't smoke a cigarette up on deck or use a flashlight or anything. And the channel was still clogged with all the debris of sunken ships, half-sunken ships and planes, and that's why it took 3 nights and 4 days to cross the channel until we finally landed at Utah Beach. I've got these little things here, this,
Just be careful because you got the
oh,
phone attached to you still.
oh, okay. All right, this, this friend who had just stopped by before went to France last year, and she visited Utah Beach, and she brought me some of the sand and the water from the ocean at Utah Beach.
Wow. Wow, that's special.
So, and then, you know, here we had to climb down the swaying rope ladders, you know, that we had practiced on, you know, that came in handy, Blinka, when you're so loaded with all this gear. And then we waded to shore the last 200 feet or so, but it was a sandy bottom, and so it was no problem.
Now let me ask you, as you were taking that 3-day, 4-day journey across the channel,
Yeah.
As you were witnessing what you were seeing in the channel, what was going through your head?
Yeah, well, it was pretty horrible. You know, we could just visualize how awful it was. Of course, you're here now. It's over. It's about 5 weeks after D-Day, and but you know, you just couldn't dwell on these things. You had to keep going, and so we just did what we had to do. Then when we landed at Utah Beach, they loaded us into trucks, and they were taking us to our hospital site, to our site, which was a cow pasture, and a Normandy cow pasture. So here we're in this truck, and we're driving through all the streets of Normandy, you know, Saint Mary, Église, Saint-Lô, and you know, we were just sitting there. We were just horrified when we saw all the bombed out buildings and the potholed roads, and everything was so desolate. And then we kept driving, and it got dark, and the trucks kept going, and it was pitch dark. You couldn't see anything. And finally the truck stopped, and the truck driver gets out and says, "Okay, lieutenants, we're lost. Everybody out. You're going to be here, stay here for the night, and we'll be back to pick you up first thing in the morning." And where was here? Here was a cow pasture. It was loaded with cows, but it meant that there were no mines there, so it was safe for the nurses to sleep in the cow pasture. And if you can just visualize a bunch of nurses into this black cow pasture, you couldn't use your flashlights, and stepping in cow flops, and here running into a cow, you know, it was very interesting. You know, trying to find a dry spot to sleep. So we finally, you know, found a spot and managed to get some sleep. But here we were, you know, we had been so excited. We're in France. We're going to go to Paris, and French perfume, and all this stuff, and all here we are spending our first night in a cow pasture.
Not as glamorous as
Not as glamorous as we had expected. So anyways, bright and early the next morning, the trucks were there to pick us up and take us to our cow pasture in the Normandy. There were one cow pasture after another. They were all lined with hedgerows. Those hedgerows were very dangerous places, you know, because they were so thick, and you know, you couldn't see who was in them or what was behind them or below them. Anyways, but each field, the nurses slept in one cow pasture, and the male officers, and another one, and the enlisted men, and another one. They were all one after another, all divided by, you know, hedgerows and stuff. And they had these big, I think we had 3 huge tents for the nurses to sleep in. And so we were there for 7 weeks, waiting for the Germans to be kicked out of Belgium, so we could, out of Liège. That was going to be our main place for the next, that was where we were going to get our permanent hospital on the outskirts of Liège. But it took us 7 weeks waiting for the Germans to, you know, they had been occupying Liège for 2 or 3 years, and so they finally got rid of them, and then they loaded us into trains, and it took us 2 weeks. You know, we were in the Paris area for 2 weeks. this outside of Paris at another old chateau that was infested with rats and cockroaches and everything else. And as usual, we had to clean up after, We stayed there at Enghien. And then while we were there, they sent us on detached service to hospitals in Paris. And I think I think we worked there about a week or no more than 2 weeks. And some patient I have in my book there a letter, a MASH note from a French soldier. I don't know how he ever got my name. First of all, the letter's all in French. Well, I spoke French fluently at the time. I had 3 years of high school French, and boy, it really came in handy. I enjoyed the language. Anyways, but he sent it to me, Lieutenant Phillips' APO number, and that was it. Not even my hospital number or anything, and it arrived. So, of course, all the Frenchmen were all looking to marry an American nurse and go back to the USA. Oh, so anyway, so we were on this train for God knows how long. We're sitting up, they'd no beds. You sat up with all your gear piled around you for 3 nights.
What gear would you have on you?
Well, your bedding roll. First of all, you'd have your bedding roll. I can. Oh,
That's all right.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Okay. I've got some better pictures here. I've got some. I've got here.
All right, great. So after the train ride, what came next?
Well, then we finally arrived in Liège, and Liège. We were going to be in a tented hospital. They had. I'm trying to gather my thoughts. Most general hospitals, they held 1,000 beds. We were a general hospital, and general hospitals were always located 100 miles, behind the fighting lines. But because the war. Well, you heard the speech. You knew then that this was an experiment of putting a general hospital in tents as close to the fighting lines as possible. So that's why our hospital was being built. It was in Liège, and eventually, I guess they had planned this. They knew that they knew what was coming, and but the hospital had not. The tents had not yet been erected. They hadn't poured the cement or anything. So in the meantime, while they were, getting the hospital ready, the nurses stayed in a 4-story building in the heart of Liège, and I have pictures of that. And so we were there for a few months. Let's say we landed in Liège on October 11th. Well, we were there, at least a couple of months, and so every day would walk up this hill to the 15th General Hospital, which was a big hospital, the size of ours, 1,000 beds, and it was. They were already getting casualties from the Battle of Aachen, which was 18 miles away. That was, the nearest large German city. And so we were on detached service working there. And I was working in the operating room there. And, I said it seemed that almost every patient that came in had had some extremity amputated. So that's what we did until our hospital was ready for us to move out. And then once our hospital was open, then we would go on this. They didn't have any place yet for the nurses, so we had to commute from this 4-story building across 3 bridges to get to our hospital area out at Fay-en-Bois, which was a little suburb of Liège, and that's where our tent hospital was located. And so they'd load us in the trucks, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and would, work through the night and then come back, would get back about 10 o'clock the next morning. And but would have to cross on this pontoon bridge. Oh, then, Liège, they started sending the buzz bombs. This was one of the worst parts of the whole war. The approaching Germans and the buzz bombs. That was the worst thing of all.
And let me ask you before we get into that. What was your role in the operating room? What were you?
I was a surgical nurse. I would, assist the, hand instruments to the doctors. Do whatever a surgical nurse does.
Okay, so if you could continue on with
Yes. Well, so that's what we did, and then after Hitler started sending his buzz bombs into Liège because they wanted to destroy all the trains, their rail line, which went to all the surrounding countries, and where was I now?
You're talking about how the buzz bombs were probably one of the worst.
Oh yeah, and then when we had to, when we went on duty, when we left our 4-story building to go to our hospital at Fayembois, we had to go over these 3 bridges, and they were pontoon bridges. I think 2 of them were pontoon bridges, one was regular, and that was awful because the truck driver would stop the truck just before we got on the pontoon bridge and had just scanned the sky to see if any buzz bombs were coming, and then if there were none were coming, he'd hop in the truck and would go hell-bent for election across the bridge. And you just never wanted to have a bomb come over when you're in the middle of that pontoon bridge. This was on the Meuse River, which ran the length of Liège. And then when we got over the other side, then the truck would take us to our tent hospital, and we'd start working, and we were on 12-hour duty shifts, and would work there till the next morning, and then would go back through it, the whole thing all over again. So we'd usually get back around 10 o'clock in the morning, but it was hard to sleep because buzz bombs were knocking buildings all around us. You never knew. It wasn't easy.
Now, is that where you spent the majority of your time in Liège?
Yeah. Well, then until we were there for a couple of months, until, the enlisted men and the male officers were living in tents out at Fayembois. And finally, we nurses went on, we had a meeting with the colonel, and we said, we want to move out to Fayembois. We'll sleep in tents or foxholes or anything. We can't, we can't keep on like this. And so finally, at first, the colonel accused us of being traitors and of all sorts of things. And we have but one life to give for our country and so forth, this bull. Anyways, but yet the next day, he apparently had a change of heart, and so the next day we moved out to Fayembois, and we slept in tents there and then they moved us into this old 16th century chateau. And the chateau was 5 stories high. My roommate and I were on the top floor, and oh my God, when we see all the pictures of those stairs, first of all, there was no central heating at all. The place was as cold as ice. There was no running water. There was no electricity, and everything. You took your shower and your helmet, and every day they'd bring up a pail of water, and on each floor, and put it next to the fire bucket, and then you'd dish out water and put it in your helmet, and that was what you used for washing and for bathing and for showering and for washing your clothes. And that's what we had. You didn't see bathtubs or showers. They had no flush toilets. And of course, then they had the 2, 4, or 6 holers, depending on the number of people in each floor. And these wooden things with just a hole on the top with a bucket underneath. And then when we got German prisoners of war, they took care of all that, emptying them and delivering the water and stuff. And that's the way we lived the whole time we were in Liège, you know, once our hospital was ready for occupancy.
Yeah. Now you said you guys had 1,000 beds.
Yeah.
How quickly did they fill up?
Immediately.
And were they? Were you at full capacity?
We were at full capacity, yeah, because on November 16th, you know, the Americans began this huge offensive against the Germans, and we had to be ready to receive casualties. And the cement floors hadn't even been poured yet in the tents, so. And then, you know, Belgium was inundated by these heavy torrential rains, and everything was just a sea of mud. It was awful. And our boots weren't waterproof at all. Our feet were always waterlogged. But eventually, you know, they got the floors poured and everything got done in time. But in the meantime, we had already started receiving casualties from this November 16th invasion. This
which battle they were from?
I don't know. I've got the name of it. I know the magazine American World War II, they printed one of my stories, and the editor gave the name to that battle. But I don't remember I don't have the name of it. I've just got it in the magazine.
Now, working in those conditions, you know, working in mud, having your feet wet all the time, did that become a distraction or?
No, because you were so busy caring for the casualties that you just didn't stop to think about your own discomfort, and you didn't dare bitch. I mean, when you saw these poor guys coming in, you know, you were so full of compassion for them that you didn't dare. I mean, nobody complained.
Can you talk about some of the gentlemen that you guys received? Maybe not specifically, but are there any instances that stick out in your head as you see them coming in and the condition they're in? And
well, you know, you heard me say that it was very difficult for us not to show any signs of emotion because they were so young, so handsome, so virile, and yet some of them, you know, you knew that they'd never have a normal life again, and yet you couldn't. As I said, we told a lot of white lies. You know, you did try to get them involved in conversation. You'd ask them where they came from, and they were just happy to see an American nurse. And some of them, they hadn't spoken to an American, you know, in a couple of years, and they were happy to see us, and they were always happy to talk about their hometown. And you know, we saw, you know, 25,000 patients while we were there. So, and you know, when you heard, every so often somebody would come and say, "Hey, Phil, there's," you know, they called me Phil. That was my nickname. There's somebody from your hometown here, you know, and I'd rush over to their tent to see them, and if it was somebody I knew, but I didn't know any of them, you know, I had been away from home for so long, you know, I'd been in training in Massachusetts and so forth, but just having someone from home there it was wonderful. But they were great patients. They worried so about us. They were furious that we were, you know, so far up front. And as I said, you know, when we did get orders to evacuate our sickest bed patients, after, you know, when during the bulge, you know, they wanted us to change places with them, and of course we wouldn't go. But it was a tough time, you know, those 6 weeks. But we were all in it together, so you did what you had to do, and that was it.
Now, were you treating patients from the Battle of the Bulge in Liège, or was that at a different?
Yeah, well, this was, our hospital was still Liège. I mean, Fay-en-Bois was just a sort of a little enclave of residential homes. There were homes bordering our hospital, and I have all these pictures of bombed out homes and some of our hospital tents that were blown down, you know, and you can see the outlines, the tent outlines and so forth in front of these, pictures. And so, but that was all part of Liège.
What was I going to say? You mentioned the buzz bombs being a constant.
Oh, it was terrible. Thing. We had them for 2.5 months, every 12 to 15 minutes, 24 hours a day. You'd hear them coming in the distance, just puttering along. You'd hear that and your heart would sink. And then you'd hear it getting closer and the noise of its motor would get louder. And, the patients, they were all aware of it too. And they'd try to make a joke out of it. They'd send one of the ambulatory patients, go out and take an azimuth on him, see what track he's on, track 1, 2, or 3, but they were all scared silly. And you just never knew where it was going to fall. And then once it was over, you'd give a sigh of relief. But it was pretty rough. We were all, to this day, loud noises send me up a wall.
Now, to your understanding, the target for those bombs were the railways and transport system?
Yeah. They wanted to cut off all supplies to the Americans.
Yeah. So you guys, the hospitals weren't necessarily targets per se, but
yet
they did get.
They did on Christmas Eve. We were bombed and strafed, and at other hospitals in the area too. Liège was, there are a lot of American hospitals in the area, and they were bombed and strafed. It was one plane, but the Germans had no regard for the Geneva Conventions whatsoever. I think this one German Piper, I think that was his name. He was the worst of all of them.
Now, who was he?
He was some German colonel, and he let them, he encouraged them to bomb and stray. He had, according to Geneva Conventions, the Red Cross Brassard and the Red Cross, you're not supposed to bomb them, but he had them. They didn't abide by those rules at all.
And how close were you to that action that was happening?
Well, we were, the Germans, first they were down, they were in Bastogne. That's when they first, attacked all the Americans in Bastogne, which was 54 miles from Liège. And then, but they wanted to go up to Liège because they would cross the Meuse River over to Brussels, but then they would head straight on to Antwerp, and they would capture the port of Antwerp. That's where all our supplies, every supply, that was the only place, from the port of Antwerp. And that was what Hitler had in mind when he started sending the buzz bombs into Liège. So
that was their objective.
That was their objective, yeah.
Now, did you the constant of the bombs coming over, was there at any point where became...
A lot of people cracked up.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially several enlisted men cracked up and had to be evacuated back. A couple of male officers and one nurse, and I was so ashamed of her because she was a Jewish nurse. But she was one that, she was always standing next to me. Everything you did in the Army was done, your names alphabetically, if you lined up for anything. Her name was Noodleman, and I was Phillips, so she was always next to me. Her bed was next to mine when we slept in the huts, and she was a very bright psychiatric nurse. She really was, but she knew what was good for her. And when we were in England, I had constructed this little dressing table out of orange crates, and she was always sitting at my dressing table. And I'd say, Fanny, get out, I want to comb my hair. Oh, for God's sakes, you'd think you had the crown jewels there in your dressing table. And but she knew what was good for her. But so when all the buzz bombings, they kept going, well, she was the only nurse to evacuate, and I was so ashamed of her. And I mean, first of all, nurses don't leave their post. They stay with their patients no matter what. And I just felt it was just, she was a traitor. It wasn't easy going through, with people, you can't, these poor guys who had PTSD and who would go into a fit when they'd hear a buzz bomb. We felt sorry for them. But with her, I felt it was part of her game. She was always watching out for herself, and she ended up in France, in Reims. She ran the nurses' R&D center, and she lived like a queen. She had a chef that would cook special meals for her, and so all the nurses, when they had night off, they'd go to Reims, and here she was living like the queen bee. Anyways.
And you're of Jewish heritage as well,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah.
Were you aware of how...
Well, this is it. I was more scared than the others because of my dog tags that had an H on them, I was the only other Jewish female in the outfit.
So you were aware of what Hitler's mission was?
Oh, yes, yeah. By this time, we well knew. We weren't aware of the concentration camps, but we knew that Hitler wanted no part of the Jews, and they were trying to get to the America. We even had a relative who had come over.
Now, did you experience any anti-Semitism yourself?
Very, very. I did not in the service, not too much. Every once in a while, someone would drop some remark. They didn't know with a name like Phillips, it didn't sound Jewish, So, but someone would make some crack, but.
So it may not have been directed.
It wasn't directed at me, no, but it would just be some remark. Well, the Jews are like that or something.
So you said the bombing lasted about 2.5 months?
2.5 months, yes.
Do you remember, well, you mentioned Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that night?
Yeah, it was horrible. Yeah, well, I guess I was on night duty, and that we had a full moon that night. We had been fogged in for the whole week before, and the Germans were able to move forward on the ground, but our planes couldn't get off the ground to bomb them. And the Germans got closer and closer to Liège, and so I was on a night duty. Oh, and then the fog started lifting that afternoon, the day before, when we had evacuated a bunch of patients. And that's when my patients, made the blackjack for me to wear and gave me the spring blade knife and said, if a crowd comes, plunge the knife blade into his belly and run like hell. And the fog started lifting that afternoon, and by nighttime it had completely dissipated and a full moon arose. And I was on night duty again. And I was working in my my surgical shock tent, and it was before 8 o'clock, and I heard the sound of a plane overhead, and it was the first plane that we heard, in over a week, because they'd all been grounded by the fog, and I knew from the sound of the motor, we could tell very easily, the difference between our planes, the German planes, the British planes. We knew them, and I knew, and I stepped outside the tent to take a look. And here all these red flares were dropping through the sky. And it was a gorgeous sight, and I thought, oh my God, it's like the 4th of July, and I was just standing there mesmerized by it. And then all of a sudden the plane that had dropped these flares started flying lower, back and forth over our hospital tents, and nearby, the enlisted men's tents were all nearby also. And he was dropping anti-personnel bombs and strafing the tents. And so I ran back into my tent where my patients were all putting on their steel helmets. Everybody kept their steel helmets to their strapped to their bedside, and so I told them to get under their beds. But see, the sickest bed patients had been evacuated earlier that day, so that all my other patients were ambulatory, so they scrambled under their beds too, and I scrambled under mine, and you knew what happened there. And so, you know, once that little episode was over, and the patients all had a good laugh, and it really was good. It came at a good time because, you know, we were all so tense.
Can you describe that just so we have that?
Okay. Well, I scrambled under an empty bed, and I let out a shriek as I did so. And my corpsman, who was at the other end of the tent, called out anxiously, "Lieutenant, have you been hit?" And I called back in a very disgusted voice, "No, only by a loaded duck." Well, in hospital lingo, a loaded duck is a full urinal. And my patients all laughed uproariously at this, and it helped dispel a lot of the fear and tension we'd all felt a few minutes before. And this plane kept flying back and forth over our hospital tents and nearby enlisted men's tents, dropping anti-personnel bombs and strafing the tents. And then the anti-aircraft battery behind our hospital opened up and started shooting at them. And but they kept missing them, and instead we had flak coming through our tents, which we also didn't need. And they kept missing, and no matter how many times they shot at him, and eventually, I guess after he used up all his explosives, the plane just flew off into the night. And there were many patients and hospital personnel who were killed or wounded that night. Fortunately, nobody in my tent was wounded, but many patients, our enlisted men, there were 47 enlisted men who were injured, some very seriously, and 2 of them were killed outright. And our entire day crew came back on duty to work out in the operating rooms or surgical tents wherever needed. And it was a night of horror. No one will ever forget. They worked throughout the night and throughout the next day. And before I went off duty that morning, I stepped over to a nearby tent that I had been visiting for the past several days and nights, as there was a young soldier there from my hometown. And though we hadn't known each other before the war, just the fact that he was from my hometown so many thousands of miles away, and he had gone to my high school, and we could talk about our town. It was just a breath of fresh air. We forgot about the war for a minute. It was so wonderful to talk about all the local home places. We remembered the West Peak Mountain and Hubbard Park Lake and the crazy traffic tower at the corner of Colony and Main. And we talked about the teachers. He had gone to my high school, Meriden High School, and it was just so wonderful. We were able to forget the war for a while, and we didn't discuss the fact that he had lost an arm, a leg, and one eye. And we just talked about home, and it was so good. And then when we discovered his mother was a customer in my mother's dress shop, that almost made us kissing cousins. When I entered his tent that morning, I was shocked to see that his bed and several other beds in line with his were empty. And going off night duty with a couple of other nurses, we straggled down the path to the nurses' quarters, too empty and spent to even talk, as each of us relived the scenes of horror from the night before. And a nurse coming on day duty greeted us in the path with a muted "Merry Christmas." Merry Christmas, it sounded absolutely ludicrous. We didn't even know what day it was. And it seemed to hit all of us, the 3 of us at the same time, because we stood there bent over with hysterical laughter for a few minutes. And it was a good catharsis for our very somber moods. And then on Christmas Day had dawned bright and clear. It was the first time in over a week that the sun was out, And of course the buzz bombs had been out during the fog-bound week, but they were out as usual on their 12 to 15-minute visits. But our planes were out for the first time in over a week, and so were the German planes. And we watched as they engaged our planes in dogfights near our hospital area as spent machine gun bullets fell around us. We saw flaming planes spiraling to the ground, and as we silently prayed that they were German planes and not our planes. And chapel tents were all busy that morning, everybody coming to pray, but they didn't spend too much time praying because there were so many buzz bombs coming over that you couldn't concentrate on prayer. You were concentrating on where is this buzz bomb going to fall?
Now, at any point, did you rethink your decision to join the overseas deployment?
No, we just wanted it to be over. We just wanted to go home. And Christmas week was a nightmare with German planes coming overnight. We called them Bed Check Charlie, to drop their paratroopers dressed in American uniforms to infiltrate every American base. These paratroopers spoke a perfect English with no trace of German accent whatsoever. And they had been fully briefed in American slang. They knew all the American slang words. But one subject they hadn't been taught was of American sports. And when they were challenged by guards as they attempted to infiltrate a base, they couldn't answer such questions as who won the World Series or who's the pitcher for the Dodgers or the Yankees. And one question that could usually nab them was, what shoe size do you wear? And if they said size 44, we knew we had them. Then as Christmas week drew to a close, well, the prisoner of war compound was searched, and the Germans, the POWs, were found to have a huge stash of knives and guns they had been preparing to use in an outbreak against us. They had been working at our hospital for a few months, and they had always been very subservient and anxious to please as they went about performing their very menial but necessary jobs that freed up our enlisted men for the more important task of caring for the wounded soldiers. And the POWs carried litters and shoveled snow, replenished coal buckets, and cleaned latrines, and they were happy to be out of the fighting, happy to have a warm bed to sleep in at night and 3 square meals a day. But once the German breakthrough began, they became very arrogant and surly, and you could just tell by their actions how they really felt. And so this is what prompted the search of their compound. And as Christmas week drew to a close, more of our planes were seen in the sky, and soon they outnumbered the German planes. And the next 2 weeks, we saw huge, constant waves of our planes by day, thousands and thousands of them. And those of the RAF, the Royal Air Force, at night, as they flew on their missions to destroy the advancing German army. And it was the most heartwarming sight and sound in the world to see them and to hear them. Up in our little 5th floor chateau bedroom, we could look out the window and see the planes flying, and it was such a wonderful sight and sound. And we felt that the tides of war were turning in our favor. Thousands of Germans were captured and thousands more were surrendering. And as the American troops advanced into Germany, they mopped up pockets of resistance and destroyed German buzz bomb nests. And by January 25th, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over. In the 6-week period, 19,000 Americans had been killed, 47,000 wounded, and 21,000 missing in action, probably prisoners of war. And though there were many battles yet to be fought before the Germans surrendered on May 8th, and we were busy caring for those casualties, without the threat of being captured by the Germans or held or being buzz-bombed, our lives were peaceful and content as we did the job we came overseas to do.
Now, during the bulge, as the Germans were making their last-ditch effort, how close did they actually make it to where you guys
Well, they were 10 miles from Liège the day before Christmas, and we nurses were told all the other American hospitals had or most of them had evacuated back to either England or France. You know, the Germans were already back in Luxembourg, so a lot of them had evacuated, and we had hoped to get orders to evacuate also that never came, and instead they told the nurses to pack their musette bags with the warmest clothing they had and any first aid supplies and food supplies in the event we were captured by Germans, and to be ready to move out with 10 minutes notice. And as I noted, the first item that went into those musette bags was the French perfume we had all purchased in Paris several months earlier, and this was followed by our cigarette ration, because a pack of American cigarettes could go a long way for bartering in war-torn Europe. And we were scared, and I was more scared than the rest because I had that H for Hebrew on my dog tags, the very ones Hitler wanted to annihilate. Our patients were furious, you know, that American women were so far up front, and when orders came to evacuate our sickest bed patients that day, as we loaded them into trucks and ambulances, they begged us to change places with them. And one of my patients was so concerned about my possible capture by the Germans that he constructed this blackjack that you can see in my right hand on the picture of Bia. And this blackjack was a 10-inch length of hose stuffed with lead sinkers and suspended from my wrist by a leather thong. And his instructions were, if a kraut gets near you, slam this blackjack across his face and aim for his eyes. And another patient gave me a spring blade knife, which is also seen outlined in my left pocket. And his directions were, if a crowd approaches, plunge the knife blade into his belly and then run like hell.
So the blackjack was essentially lead weight that...
Yeah, it was inside a length of rubber hosing, and it was heavy, and then they had a little hunk, looked like a hunk of cement at the end of it, and then it was suspended from my wrist with a leather thong, and he said, yeah, aim for the eyes. You can see it, you know, in the picture.
On the book.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, you spoke earlier about a few gentlemen who may have been from your hometown that you developed a special bond with.
Yeah.
And you mentioned specifically about how you guys were talking, aside the fact from him missing limbs and
Yeah,
an eye
yeah.
and whatnot. Now you went through training
to
deal with the physical wounds and that sort of stuff.
Right.
But
And
did you go through any?
Oh, well, we also
training?
had psychiatric training. Yeah, I had a 3 months affiliation at Boston Psychiatric Hospital, too. That was part of my training.
Was that partially to prepare you for what you were going to experience? Or
Well, that was part of the nursing curriculum. But you know, it came in handy, believe me.
Now, I think I asked you this earlier, but what you actually experienced,
Yeah.
does it compare to anything that you could have imagined?
No, well, no, we knew that, you know, there might be times when, I mean, we, first of all, no one ever expected buzz bombs, you know, we didn't even know about them. And we just thought, well, maybe would get bombed or something, a regular bombing or something. You know, you just didn't know what to expect, but we just really thought, well, we're going to be there to take care of our wounded soldiers. Yeah, it's hard to, you know, we weren't, everything sort of came as a surprise to us, even though they say, well, you know, you might get captured, you might get wounded or something, but you didn't really expect it. Oh, there are too many of us, you know, we're all in this together, so.
And camaraderie
that,
there.
yeah, it was because of that, you know, that's what got you through.
And did you ever expect to be so close to the battlefront?
No. Not to have them sitting on our front door practically.
Now, as you guys were receiving casualties,
yeah.
I'd imagine that there were times they'd be coming in quicker than others.
Yeah.
How would you treat one over another? Who would get priority?
Well, they would, you know, there were different kinds of tents. They first of all, they had the admissions and discharge tents, and patients, you know, would go through the admissions, and they would get their examinations and treatment, and then they would get treated, and it all depended what branch, what sort of tent you worked in. And usually, you know, I had worked in a surgical tent where they had already had their surgery by the time they got to my tent, and so it would just be up to me to check their dressings and their vital signs, take their blood pressure and give them medications and make sure their intravenous's were running. But they had already received, you know, any surgical care that they had needed.
So in the tent that you were working in specifically, did that house 1,000 beds, or was that a small?
No, well, each
section?
tent will hold 30 soldiers. But, you know, so there are, I don't know how many tents there were in the hospital, but there are a lot of them, you know, for 1,000 beds. And
now, would you be the only nurse in that 30-man
yeah,
tent?
Yeah. Sometimes you'd have 2 tents to take care of. But I think at that time, during the bulge, I think I just had 1 tent.
And after the beds would empty, I'm assuming
the beds never cooled off. You know, we worked on the triage system, and you know, when they'd come in, you know, the treatment depended. Priority for treatment depended on the severity of the patient's wounds. And if the wounds were extremely severe, requiring long hours of surgery and many months recuperation, they didn't stay with us. They would be evacuated to a general hospital in England, France, or Belgium, or England, France, or the States, because, you know, it would take months and months for their injuries to heal, maybe years. So, but if the patients could be treated medically and surgically and returned to duty within a few weeks, and they stayed with us for treatment and rehabilitation.
And then sent back to
their units, right.
And I imagine you guys lost a fair amount of soldiers over there as well.
Oh, sure. But on the whole, you know, the statistics, later on, statistics said that, you know, so many lives were saved.
Could imagine.
Yeah.
Now, after losing a patient, would that dampen morale, or was there no time necessarily?
You didn't have the time. You couldn't wallow in pity or anything else. I mean, you carried it, you know, it was there with you all the time. Now, this one patient that I spoke about from my hometown, I wrote to my mother about it, and she, you know, this was weeks after the bulge. I figured by that time his parents would have heard from the War Department, but they had not heard from the War Department. And they were, so when my mother called and told them that I thought they would want to know that their son was in a hospital getting whatever treatment was available, that it would be a help to them to know that even though he died, he died in a bed with sheets and medication and so forth. Well, of course, they were, you know, they had not yet heard from the War Department when my mother called. So, but they were very happy to know. It meant so much to them. And then when I came home after the war, I went to visit them and had a long visit with them, telling them all about their son. Just a beautiful young boy. And
they were all pretty young.
They were all pretty young. They sure were, yeah.
Now looking back, 70 plus years.
Yeah.
How does that affect you at all?
Well, you go on with your life and you forget about it. I think adjusting after the war, I think the first chapter after the war that I wrote, I read it recently, and it was good because it explained how I felt. I was neither here nor there. I was still in the Army and still back home. Once I got home, I got home, I guess, before a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, and the taxi driver planked my Valpak on my mother's front porch, and I had carried 3 bottles of French champagne home. Well, 2 of them broke, but one didn't break, and we had that for Thanksgiving dinner. And we were all, my mother and my sister and brother-in-law and my brother, we were there, and my brother-in-law opened the champagne bottle, and the noise that it made, it sent me flying under the table, the buzz bombs. And I burst into tears, and it was, just the shock of it. I was ready to duck again. That's just how it affected you.
Yeah. And you said you still...
I still, to this day, loud noises, I am abnormally, I jump inside. I mean, I was never that way before. I could tolerate a loud noise, but these days I still feel it.
After that onslaught of constant bombardment, once that had come to an end...
Yeah. You couldn't stand the peace and quiet. I wrote, too, about... after the week after the bulge, they sent all the hospital personnel away on 1 week's rest cure. Well, they sent my roommate and me to this little village, Charleroi. It was we stayed in an old deserted schoolhouse in this little town. There was nothing doing there. They didn't even have a movie house, and there was nothing to do. They had this big classroom, and here are our cot beds, and we each had a dressing table. There was nothing to dress up for, and there was nothing to do, and the peace and quiet of that place drove us nuts. We couldn't wait to get back to our hospital with the buzz bombs and everything. It was awful. That whole week, it just dragged.
Now, after the Battle of the Bulge came to an end...
Yeah. Then life was peaceful, then we settled down, we did our work. We were still, getting casualties. But, that was until May 8th, when Germany surrendered.
So you guys were still in the same...
Oh, we were still there, but then after VE Day, which... May 8th. Then they sent us in July. We sent our hospital was sent back to France, and we stayed. This was an old riding caserne where they had horses, and they had converted it into a hospital, and so we were sent back there. And I had 600 German POWs to take care of because I was the only Jewish nurse, and they felt, Yiddish. I could speak Yiddish, which was similar to German, but I couldn't speak a word of Yiddish anyways. And they taught me to say, haben Sie Schmerzen and wo ist die Schmerzen? Have you got pain? Where is the pain? So they'd point here or here or here, And so I had to take care of these Krauts, who had been trying to kill me. Anyways, we did it because they were human beings, and this was our job. This is what we were trained to do. But we did not have the love for them that we had for our patients. Our patients were so wonderful. We loved each and every one of them. And so here I had all these krauts to take care of.
Were you ever fearful of being, I mean, were you alone with 600 enemies?
No, well, I had corpsmen around, you know. So
if anybody had tried anything,
oh yeah, yeah,
you would have been
yeah,
protected.
yeah. But you know, this was a super duper race. They had 67-year-old men and 14-year-old boys in German uniform. You know, were getting the dregs to. You know, they had been fighting for a long time.
Yeah.
And you know, you did what you had to do.
You mentioned you had written home to your mother, specifically. You mentioned an instance, but were you able to constantly keep in contact with
Oh
family
yeah,
back?
yeah. The mail service was really excellent. Although you know there were some weeks when you couldn't. Sometimes you couldn't discuss the war. You couldn't discuss places or dates or anything else. But you know, when it was all over, then you could talk about it. But during the I mean, first of all, we didn't have time to write letters. And secondly, I didn't want to worry my mother. She was worried sick. She hadn't gotten any mail from me for a few weeks. And I know a friend of mine was getting married Christmas week, and she invited my mother to her wedding, and my mother burst into tears at the wedding because she hadn't heard from me. You know, this was Christmas Day, I guess. And, you know, but...
So after Germany had surrendered,
yeah.
how did you feel?
Oh my God, we were euphoric. It was, well, we knew it was coming, you know, the last few weeks, you know, in the American advances, we could see them and hear them, you know, we knew that it was coming. But finally, when it did come, it was, everybody was so happy. And we had just received a load of American officers who had been prisoners of war of the Germans, and they had been rescued, and they had brought them to our hospital. They weren't terribly sick. They were, you know, some were malnourished or needed a little medication, but they didn't have any serious injuries. And one officer asked me to go out with him that night to go to our officers' club and celebrate. And I said, okay, but then when I got back to the nurses' chateau, we got word that the colonel had ordered a big truck to take all the nurses to the officers' club in Liège to really celebrate. And I wanted to do that so badly. I wanted to be with my friends and the ones we had worked together all, so I went with them. But I always felt so guilty about standing up that poor guy, you know, here he had been a prisoner of war, I don't know for how many months, and I always felt so guilty, but I didn't have time. I couldn't get back to him to tell him that I couldn't go. And but we had a great time. Everybody got stinking from drinking. They were stinking from drinking, believe me. And you know, you were just singing and yelling and drinking and dancing, and it was wonderful.
Now, after the war had ended in Europe,
Yeah.
was there any possibility of you being sent to the Pacific?
Oh yes, yeah, this is what we expected. Yeah, this is what we were so afraid of. But then the war in Japan, then they had signed the peace treaty with Japan in August, and so that settled that. So then, but up until then, we were sure we were going to get sent to the Pacific. So we were even making plans, you know. But once that was done, then we just wanted to get home. We just wanted, the waiting was the worst part. Then they'd send us on leaves all over. We went to the Riviera, and oh, that was wild. 'Cause that was a whole week of carousing, you know. I had my this Belgian woman whose home boarded our hospital, and she was just the sweetest lady, and her cleaning woman did my laundry. I mean, how much good laundry can you do in a helmet? And so she'd come every couple of days and pick up laundry every few days. And this woman, this Madame Smeets, just loved me like a daughter. She never had a daughter. She had one son, Hubert, who was a school teacher, and there was a little something wrong with him. And anyways, when I was told that we were going to get leave to go to the Riviera, so what could I wear at the Riviera? My combat pants and stuff. So one of my flyboy boyfriends had given me a white nylon parachute. So she sat up all night long making me a beautiful evening gown to wear. It was gorgeous, and I have a picture of it in my book. And but I didn't have any. Can you wear combat boots with an evening gown? So I went into Liège. Well, shoes had been rationed for years. Leather shoes. So they had ersatz shoes. Cardboard shoes. So I was wearing that and on the Riviera in Nice, and all the nails kept coming up. So if I ended up throwing the shoes away and just going barefoot through, doing everything, dancing, we were dancing and stuff. But it was wonderful. And then I met classmates of mine in the Riviera. They were all celebrating, and it was great. It was like old home week. Guys we had known from the Air Corps and the infantry, different infantry outfits and stuff. And it was one big happy party down there for a solid week. We drank and we ate and we took baths. We spent hours taking baths, hot running water. And wow, we went crazy. I have a picture of me in the train going down, that you'd be in these compartments. And every time the train would stop, one of the soldiers got out and picked flowers, and I kept sticking them in my hair. And it looked as though I had a hat on made out of flowers. And it was just, that was fun. And then we got another leave to go to Switzerland. And the gals that I went to Switzerland with, Johnny Johnson, we were at the nurses' quarters for nurses at Mulhouse on the Swiss-French border, and she got word from her fiance, who was a pilot stationed in Egypt, and she had written to him, or she had called him. I guess they were able to get phone calls through once in a while, and she had said that she was going to be on leave in Switzerland. So he could call back and said, "We're going to get married, I'm coming to Switzerland." So here we were staying at this, place for nurses. All of a sudden the name, anyways, they had to scrounge around. The Red Cross was trying to get a wedding dress for her so she could be married properly. And finally, she was the only bride in all of Europe who wore a wedding gown that the back of it said, "Through the courtesy of the American Sugar Refining Company." But they made her a beautiful wedding gown. And so she and her flyboy, and he became a very big radio commentator in England for years. What the heck was his name? Oh, I forget now. He was well known, and so she lived in England with him after the war. But coming back, just as I started to say, it was adjusting was difficult, because I was for a few months I was neither here nor there. Every time a troop train or a ship would land, and I'd get a phone call from one of my Army buddies or a classmate getting out of the service, and I'd hop on the train and go to Boston or New York, and I'd still wear my uniform. You waited all these months to wear civilian clothes, but I couldn't take the uniform off. And of course, anybody in uniform didn't have to pay any money on the trains. and would meet, always in one of the hotels, and would sit and would reminisce and drink and just rehash the war all over again. And this went on for months. Once I went to Long Island, my old dear girlfriend who lived there, and I went down to visit her. She was living with her mother and father and her young baby, and I guess her husband was still overseas or something. Anyways, I had carted this heavy suitcase all the way out to Long Island, and I was there, half an hour. I said, I got to go home. Just unrest, unease. So I just packed up, and I hadn't even unpacked my suitcase, but I just took my pocketbook. Sorry, I can't stay, and I just wanted to get back home. So I got the next best train to Penn Station and back to Meriden.
Now, how long after you returned home were you then discharged from the Army?
I guess the discharge came through in January. I had gotten home in November, mid-November.
And were you just awaiting discharge for those 2 months, or were you?
No, we were completely free. You were on your own. There were no formal ceremony or anything. Just got my discharge papers, I guess, in the mail and stuff like that.
And did you start? Did you work during that time?
Then I did. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew I did not want to do civilian nursing, because there was no patient on earth as wonderful as G.I. Joe, and so I did private. It took me a couple of months at least before I decided what I wanted to do, and I did some private duty cases, and then I decided I took a cruise to Havana, to Cuba. And then, they were still doing them to Cuba and Nassau, and I had to spend all my the money that I made that I couldn't spend when I was overseas.
How much were you paid as a nurse?
You think I remember? I can't remember. I've got it in my records. I just don't remember what our. Was a lot more, I think, than we got than nurses were getting, civilian nurses were getting when I left the States.
I sure hope so.
Yeah. I'll have to look it up.
Okay. So after your trip down to Cuba.
Yeah, then I decided, here I was living at home. My mother was going to work in her dress shop every day. And so then I went to work for a local physician. I worked in his office, and I did office nursing for a while. But then I decided I wanted to go to New York and work there. My sister was working in New York. She was living in New York and working there at the same time too, and so. I went to New York, and this girl that I had is a roommate aboard. When I went to Nassau, I shared a cabin with this gal. Wait a minute, no, that was something else. When this trip to Havana, that was something else. I didn't pay for a single stateroom. I shared a stateroom with somebody, and I walked in the stateroom. This little gal with black hair was kneeling on, and she was unpacking, and she had a thick, heavy Southern accent, and she said, "Oh, I'm getting my paintings out. I hope you don't mind all my paint." I said, "No." She introduced herself. It's Dottie Grider, and she was from Kentucky, Bowling Green, I think. And she stood up and she said, and she threw her arms around me. She was a tiny little thing with black bangs, and She said, "Oh, I'm so glad for 3 things. I'm so glad you're young, you're not a Negro, and you're not a Jew." And so this I was going to be sharing a stateroom with for 2 weeks. And I was floored. I didn't know what to say. And so I decided, well, the ship is filled. There are no more staterooms. So I'll just live with it, and that's it. So I lived with it, and we got along fine, and we did everything, went to meals together, and I was up on deck with her, and she was a marvelous painter. And, people would gather around watching her do seascapes and landscape, whatever, and she was great. She used to make these little golden books for children, which are now really big. They're very valuable. And when I had kids, she used to send them up to me. But
they became pretty big.
Yeah.
They had the gold spine.
Yeah.
She created those?
She created those, yeah. She was a great artist. Well, as a matter of fact, that's one of her paintings there, that Cape Cod scene. Anyhow, we got to be very good friends. And after the war, I saw, especially when I went to New York to work, and she had her own studio apartment down in Gramercy Park, and I used to go down there a lot. And but while we were aboard ship, and I think I wrote about this, there were these three plumbers. They were married, and the 3 plumbers were traveling together. They left their wives and kids home, and they were just going off on a toot for themselves. And they loved to dance. So here, every night would go to the ballroom. There was, nothing else to do aboard ship, and the men were outnumbered 50 to 1 by women. So I was glad I always had one of these plumbers would ask me to dance with them. And then one day I was terribly seasick, and I didn't come up on deck, and I was puking all over the place. And they came rapping at our stateroom door, and Dottie answered the door, and they said, "What's happened to Muriel? Well, why hasn't she been up on deck?" And she said, "Muriel just fine," and I was getting better then. And she, slammed the door. And then when I came up on deck, and they, were happy to see me, and they said, "You know what your roommate is?" And I said, "What?" And they said, "She's a lesbian." And I said, "Oh," I said, "I've never seen one." I said, "They never taught us about them in training." Well, they said, "Just watch out for her. Don't let her get too friendly." Well, anyways, we had no problems, but it scared the life out of me for a while. Oh, so then when they said that, I said, "Oh my!" Because every night, every time I had the upper bunk, and she'd climb up and she'd kiss me on my lips, and so then it dawned on me when they said that. I said, "Oh, so this is why she's kissing me on the lips." And then they said, "Well, don't let her get too friendly." So that's when I ran back to the stateroom, and I said to her, "You know what? I'm a Jew." And well, then she started to cry. She felt so bad, and she felt terrible. She said, "But you don't have horns." And I said, "Well, since when do Jews have horns?" Well, in art classes, they always have the statue of Moses with horns, or was it David? Moses with horns. And a lot of people, especially in those days, thought Jews had horns. So she felt terrible, but we remained good friends over the years.
I wonder if that changed her perspective.
Oh, well, I guess it must have. Well, she learned a lesson too. She apologized profusely, "But you're so nice." So I said, "Since when do Jews have horns?" Well, that's what they always told them in art classes. And it's true, and you see pictures of the statues, and there he is with horns. So
it's amazing how far we've come.
Oh, yeah.
We still have a long ways to go.
Oh, there's so much anti-Semitism today. It's just sickening. We're going back to the Holocaust, what's going on.
Well, let me ask you about that, the current events, with the few weeks ago in Charlottesville, and are you from?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What's going on? How does that resonate with you? I mean,
oh, it's terrible. This country is so divided now. It is just awful what's going on. You know, I'm just afraid, you know, with the anti-Semitism, it's starting all over again. And it's bad enough that, you know, the blacks are against the whites, and of course the whites, then the white supremacists, why don't they arrest them? Why do they let them, you know, go around preaching hatred, you know? There's no end to it. This country is in a horrible shape. It's not the way it was when we grew up. We learned respect for every color, and I had, you know, little Negro friends, and it was fine. There was no problem. I don't know. I don't like what's going on. And ever since, you know, the Democrats have never gotten over the fact that the Republicans, that Trump won, and they're going out of their way to make life difficult for him. That's my feeling. He's got enough to contend with, you know, he's not the greatest, you know, he's got a big mouth, but on the whole, he has some good plans, and I don't know.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I don't think the media is making things.
Oh, they're his worst enemy.
Yeah, but also his best friend at the same time. It's interesting how they play into.
Oh yeah. But he wouldn't have to do this tweeting if they would give him the right time of day. But you know, the headlines you see are horrible.
Well, it's all anti.
Yeah, it is. You know.
He spoke in Phoenix a few days ago.
Yeah.
In Arizona, and I saw on CNN they posted a headline that said 58 things that Trump had screwed up, or something he had done wrong.
Yeah.
So I read through those, and then I actually went and listened to the speech.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's not perfect. I'm not a huge
No.
supporter of him.
Yeah.
But they were digging, and they were nitpicking.
Oh, they sure do nitpick. One of his speech was really presidential. It was really good. I forget which one that was, but he's his own worst enemy. You know, he's got to shut up. He doesn't. But he means well for the country. I wouldn't trust with everything that Hillary did, and she's gotten away with in Benghazi. That was a terrible thing. I'll never forgive her for that. So, anyways.
Yeah, without getting too deep into politics.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting, because I think that CNN, just from that one instance, they're doing it for ratings, for attention.
Oh
they
yeah.
know that he'll call them out. And
oh yeah.
Then it drives people to them. So it's
it ain't
interesting
good.
to see. But
yeah.
One thing I always ask is if there's any advice, any wisdom that you can bestow upon, you know, my generation and future generations, what would that be?
Oh, I'll think about it at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's I don't know. There's so much hatred going on that we weren't brought up with it. And I don't know whether it'll ever go away. It's, you know, you could say love thy neighbor. They don't love you know, there's always this, but I don't know. I really can't say. We're screwed up. This is a terrible time in the history of this country. It really is. Everybody's fighting everybody else. There's more protesters going on. I just don't like it.
Especially after living through
what
you've lived through,
Yeah.
and seen the sacrifice firsthand.
Right.
You know, the people that fought for the freedom that we have today.
Yeah.
Some people say that they were fighting for even those who speak out who are promoting violence and hatred. I've heard some views that the people that fought also fought for their freedom of speech.
Yeah. Where does it end, though?
Right.
Where does it end? Like
Right.
these the ones who hate the whites, the Ku Klux Klan and that bunch, David Duke. Why should they be allowed to preach hate for the color of someone's skin? And things like that. I don't like the freedom of speech. But yet they're allowed to do it. They shouldn't. They should have some kind of law that goes against that, protects people from people like them.
Hopefully it gets better.
Geez, I don't know. I'm 96. I can't expect it. I don't know. I hope so. I hope for them.
Does it feel like we're almost moving backwards a little bit?
Yeah, that's, this stuff in Charlottesville is terrible. And, even the police stood by, they did nothing. What's happening to the police? It's a stinking job. They get shot at too. But I don't know. I don't know what the future holds. The immediate future, anyways.
How would you like to be remembered? How would you like your legacy to be carried on?
Well, I guess it was the one that I was brought up with, just to have respect for every human being. Of course, now you talk about ISIS. I don't respect them. But, we're all God's creatures. How could God create some like them when you see them cutting their heads off? I don't know. I'd have to think that one over.
One of the last questions I have for you. How do you feel that your contributions during World War II helped, or how do you feel that?
I'm happy. I'm happy for my contribution. I feel satisfied because, it gave me the experience so that I can go out and talk to, I go to Fullerton every year and speak to the classes there, and it's just shocking to see how little, I don't know what they're teaching them in schools today, but they know nothing about the Great Depression. They don't know anything about World War II, about Pearl Harbor. That they think that the Vietnamese started Pearl Harbor, and but they just don't know anything about it. And the Holocaust, that they've heard something, but they don't believe it. And so when I can, influence some minds, like it meant a lot to me. And I get letters all the time, and I get letters from the students that I speak to. But the last time I spoke, or was it the time before at Fullerton, at the college there, the professor told me afterwards, she said she had two students, one was from Iraq and one was from Iran, who were here getting their college tuition paid for by the U.S. government, and she said yet they did not want to become American citizens. And so she said after my speech, she said they came up to her and they told her they wanted to become American citizens. So that was very gratifying. And I get letters from people in Belgium continually. I have one I was going to read at the end of my speech, but he was running short of time, and got from somebody in Belgium. I get them from Belgian students and from people, from adults. and telling us how they go to the American cemeteries and they take care of the American graves, and they are still grateful for what we did in World War II. So it's very gratifying knowing that that we're still remembered for what we did there.
And it seems almost more so in Europe than
Yes.
in our
Yeah.
own country.
You know, it was so funny when we first came home, you know, for months all you did was talk about going home, going home. We got home and the general attitude was, well, I'm so glad, you know, you came home, you're safe or sound, we don't talk about it. I know you want to forget about it, and let's get on with our lives, the war is over. And this was it until the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And then once that happened and people started talking about it again, and then I got invited to speak at the schools and different meetings, and all of a sudden everybody started realizing that World War II was something big. And then all of a sudden it's grown and grown, and everybody stops you on the street and thanks you. You know, I got license plates for a car that says Battle of the Bulge, and when my husband does the driving and people stop and shake his hand and thank him for being in the Battle of the Bulge. So anyways.
Do you let him know sometimes the real scenario? Or?
Oh yeah, well he tells them immediately. He said, it's my wife, not me.
I could imagine the looks on their faces.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a pretty crucial time in history right now. As you know, one generation is sadly leaving.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is it. They have a shortage of this Bill Lewis, who runs the Pearl Harbor Day train, and I've been on that for the past 6 years. And he said he was looking. He said, when you speak at Chino, I had told him I was going to be speaking at the museum, and he said, see if you can find a couple of World War II veterans so I can get them for the Pearl Harbor Day train. But he's got a whole list now. I got an email from him.
Good.
But you know, I did make the announcement before I spoke in Chino.
Well, it's great that you speaking actively with you know the youth of today, and you know there's nobody better to hear it from than somebody who witnessed it and lived through it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's important that that information is passed along. And
it is.
Because I went to school in the 90s. I graduated early 2000s, and my knowledge of World War II was minimal. And I've probably 90% of the knowledge that I have now has come within the last 2 years, just from speaking with veterans.
Did you have any family members who were in World War II?
Oh, my grandfather was, and his brother was. My grandfather lived until 2014. So
where was he?
Where was he stationed?
Yeah.
He was in the Pacific. He was in the Navy. In the Pacific. But I had 26 years with him, and never really dug too deep into his history, his service history, and it wasn't until his passing that sort of opened my eyes. And the honor flight trip, you know what those are about. So it kind of opened my eyes to the whole event and the people who were involved in it. And it's important. They don't focus on it.
Now, were you on the honor flight?
I've been not on the one that you were on.
Oh, okay.
I've done about 11 of them over the last 3 years.
Were you at the meeting in was it Arcadia or something that they had recently?
No, I was at I met you at the Plains of Fame in Chino, but I haven't been to Arcadia.
Because I got a call yesterday from this woman. Well, she and her husband were on she was accompanying him on the honor flight. I didn't even remember which one she was, but she had my name, and she said they had all had this big celebration in Arcadia, and Marva X was there, and Marva had put out this book about it, and she had a copy that she wanted to deliver to me, and I just couldn't even remember who she was. The memory these days is pretty bad, especially for names.
I know you seem to be seem to have it.
I can remember what happened 70 years ago, but I don't know what I had for breakfast. So, you're Zach.
I am Zach.
Coco.
Absolutely.
Well.
Very good. Now, is there anything else that I failed to pry into, or anything that you'd like to add? And
No, I don't know, unless you want to see any photographs that I have, or.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll conclude
Okay,
this.
are you hungry? You know, I made some egg salad